Hello Neighbor is an indie horror game made by tinyBuild during the 2010s, and it managed to gain a large amount of popularity online due to YouTubers being unable to get enough of it. And for good reason, as it was a genuinely interesting concept, and if tinyBuild were to have successfully pulled it off, then I believe that Hello Neighbor would be one of the greatest indie horror games around. However, as this video is called Hello Neighbor Fallen from Grace, you can probably assume that it doesn't go so well. In fact, it got so bad that they would end up begging our Lord and Saviour MatPat, God rest his soul, to make theories on their overly mediocre Hello Neighbor cartoon. But how could we have got to this, you may be wondering? Well, to answer that, we're going to have to go to the very beginning. Okay, so first of all, I want to talk about the announcement trailer, because that was our first ever look at the game, and we do have earlier footage, for example the DevGam footage, that shows us the state of the game in 2014, but I want to talk about the announcement trailer because it sets up what the game was truly supposed to be about. It was supposed to be a game where you as the player try to break into your neighbor's house so that you can find out what exactly he is hiding in his basement. But every time you get caught by him, his AI will learn how you play and then attempt to counteract you. For example, if I were to go through the front door on one attempt and proceed to get caught, then the next time the front door will be locked in advance, so I'll have to ring the doorbell or throw something at his window to get him to come outside and unlock the front door, which is great gameplay in my opinion, as it forces players to adapt and it makes the AI adapt to you. So really, it was just a fantastic concept, although we didn't get to play the game until the release of the pre-alpha on the 29th of September 2016. The pre-alpha gave Hello Neighbor a lot of well-deserved attention because people were finally able to try out everything that I mentioned a moment ago. And yeah, the pre-alpha may have differed from the announcement trailer, but it was kind of an improvement. Like, for example, the house we see in the announcement trailer that was kind of like a maze, which could have worked, but seeing as this is someone's house, it wouldn't really make sense. Like, hell, he has to get around the house as well, you know, so I prefer what they did with the house in the pre-alpha. Although I do wish they had kept some of the features from the announcement trailer in the game, like the ability to take out light bulbs and then place them in different places, but it's not really a big deal that they didn't add it, so yeah. It was a great start, and though it lacked a real ending, it was a good sign for what was to come, which is why people were also hyped when Alpha 1 dropped, which sadly is the best this game has ever been. But let's not dwell on that for a moment, shall we? Instead, let's just talk about what Alpha 1 did well, because it was really good and just a massive improvement on the pre-alpha. So I want to mention three main things that the alpha did well, starting with the house, which was increased in size so you could now explore the second floor as well. Hell, it even included a train, so obviously it was much bigger, but size doesn't always matter, people, which means this could have been the biggest house in the world and it wouldn't have mattered, because what matters is what they include, and each of the rooms in this alpha felt like they had purpose, which may sound a little strange, but think about it. If you played a million horror games that just have rooms with very little decoration just there to fill space, they wouldn't leave any impression on you. But if you walk into a room in some neighbor's house and find a grave, even if you know you're playing a horror game and are expecting to be scared, that's still going to make you feel uncomfortable and stick with you. So 10 out of 10 on the house design. But I'll stop glazing it now and talk about the second thing that this alpha does well, which is the story, because it allowed theorists to get involved. And yeah, in retrospect, maybe they shouldn't have, because theorists have had a pretty negative effect on tinyBuild, but at the time it was cool, and I did enjoy watching MatPat's videos on it. Hell, I might watch them again, but that's besides the point. The point is, I like that they were trying to make a story. But on to the final point for Alpha 1, which is the neighbor himself, because this guy was genuinely very threatening in this alpha. Like, first of all, he was a genius and would place bear traps so often that the game may as well have been called Hello Hunter. And this guy now had a new chase theme that was absolutely horrifying. So if your heart doesn't start pumping while he's chasing you in Alpha 1, then you might need to visit the doctor because you could already be dead, sadly. But your serious crisis aside, Alpha 1 was truly the best this game has ever been, and for good reason. It was incredible, and I really wish they kept that momentum going forward, but as you already know, they don't. So let's not beat around the bush and just get into Alpha 2. Which does a lot wrong, and I'll go through as many things as possible, starting with the fact that this alpha has a scripted break-in scene, instead of just letting you break in on your own, which could have worked because a little bit of hand-holding in a video game never hurt anybody, but in the case of Hello Neighbor, I think just letting the player have an authentic experience breaking in is much better than forcing them into a scripted scene, as breaking in naturally allows you as the player to explore and find things out for yourself. So I would have preferred if they just continued letting us attempt to break in on our own without any scripted stuff at all. But moving on, because they also changed the house in this alpha, making it a lot smaller than in Alpha 1, which could have worked because, as I said before, size isn't everything, although in this case, it didn't work. The rooms aren't as interesting, and the overall feel of the house is just not as good. Like, this is just some guy's house. Even if it does have some quirks to it, I can imagine some regular guy living here, not some strange guy that seems like he's killed someone. So the house was just kind of a disappointment, and the new art style wasn't much better. Even though they did improve the overall graphics of the game, it didn't matter because the new cartoony art style just doesn't work with the game, so I will be forever annoyed about that. But on to the next thing, which is the introduction of a character model that should have been a good thing, but yet they managed to mess this up as well, because the character model's hand covers a part of the screen, and if you're holding an item in your hand, it's even worse. But surely they'll fix this by the next alpha, and if not, they're definitely going to have it fixed by the full release. Right? I mean, they'll surely fix it, so no reason to dwell on it any longer, which is why I'm going to move on to the one thing that I did like about this alpha. And I'm going to be honest, I haven't really covered everything that this alpha does badly, but I've covered the main issues, so let's talk about the one thing that I did like, which was the basement, because unlike the past alphas, you could actually enter this one before the game cuts off, and I do genuinely think that the basement is at least a little creepy, so good job on that tiny build, but we've already talked about Alpha 2 for far too long, so let's start talking about Alpha 3, which is probably the worst in my opinion, as this alpha is set completely at night, which might not sound too bad on the surface, but think about it, you're exploring the neighbor's house that's already got poor lighting at night, so it's almost impossible to see what you're doing in some parts of the house, and this doesn't even work as a way of making the game scarier. It's just annoying, especially when you take into account the fact that getting close to the neighbor makes the sides of your screen darken, so you might not even realize you're being jump scared until after it's happened. So the simple strat of using darkness in your game to create a larger sense of fear doesn't work here, which is so stupid because it really shouldn't be that hard to implement. But hey, I'm going to stop getting angry at them for that because they do kind of fix this going forward, but there is still more I need to discuss for Alpha 3, like the puzzles, which in earlier alphas were much better. For example, the classroom puzzle in Alpha 1. There was math questions on the board, and there was magnetic numbers in the room that you could use to answer them. Simple, right? Well, that's not how Alpha 3 is. In fact, there is a puzzle in Alpha 3 that allows you to find a blue key. The only hint you're given is a piece of paper with a picture of a blue key inside of a golden apple on it. So you might assume that it has something to do with the various golden apples that are lying around the house. Well, you'd be wrong because the blue key is actually behind a painting of a golden apple. A painting that you have to parkour over to, so something that you will probably overlook, and the only reason I know it's there is because I watched someone play the game before I did. And speaking of parkour, this alpha has a lot more platforming, which is very strange because this game isn't a platformer, it's a stealth-based horror, so I don't know why they did this. And also, This alpha involves stacking items on top of each other, which is weird because the items in this game already have ragdoll physics, so trying to stack is a nightmare. This game isn't like Minecraft where you can just click to put an item on top of another one. You have to try and throw it on top of the pile, which can make the whole pile implode. So really, it's just strange that they were trying to add more platforming to a game that wasn't built for it in the first place. But yeah, in conclusion, Alpha 3 is bad, and I may not have said as many things about this one as I did the last one, but that's because it doesn't really improve on much aside from not having a scripted break-in scene. And the house wasn't improved either, despite it going back to being bigger. So again, I guess size really doesn't matter, but either way, we only have one last alpha to talk about, so let's just get into it, shall we? And I'm gonna be honest with you here, Alpha 4 is really not any better than Alpha 3. Even though they got rid of the Eternal Night, it's still awful. As firstly, the neighbour, who used to be powered by a smart AI that would adapt to your playing style, is now just not even that big of a threat. Instead, all he does is patrol the perimeter of his house, like a pitbull or something. So breaking in is far easier than it was in the early alphas, as now if I break in through the front door on one attempt and then get caught, I can just go through the front door again, because he won't have locked it. He's not smart enough to do that anymore. In fact, he's really, really dumb now, and if the neighbour seemed off to you, you should also see the house, because some walls and floors don't even have textures, which makes this alpha less polished than the likes of Alpha 1 and the pre-alpha, for crying out loud. It's almost like they didn't even care at this point, which is just so sad. And also, they seem to think that the platforming from the last alpha was so great that they'd dedicate a whole minigame to it. That's mandatory for you to beat the game, but I'll talk more about the mini-games when I get to talking about the full game, which, funnily enough, should be right around now, because I really don't need to talk any more about Alpha 4, as it doesn't exactly improve on anything, it just makes more problems. And I'm also not going to talk about the betas, because they're really just preparations for the full release, although I will say that the Bendy and the Ink Machine crossover is cool, because that's an actually competent horror game. But with that all said and done, why don't we just begin talking about the full game? So, Hello Neighbor was fully released on the 8th of December 2017, and you can probably assume by now that it isn't very good, but let's not focus on that for a second, as the full game follows a 4-act structure that I'm going to explain the story of. Act 1 starts off with a young boy named Nicky Roth kicking his ball down the road before noticing his suspicious neighbour Mr. Peterson in his house. So he does whatever a normal young boy would do and breaks into his neighbour's house, which is the house from Alpha 2, just a little bit different, and honestly, I still don't like it, even more so now because a part of Act 1 actually makes you stack items so that you can get up onto the roof of the neighbour's house, which is just, again, so stupid. It's not like this game is advertised as a platformer, so you'd assume that you have to complete some sort of puzzle to get on the roof, but no, it's just box stacking simulator. This isn't a platformer, and it never has been. But enough about that, because poor Nicky Roth has made it to the basement where he gets captured by the neighbour, thus making him a missing child. And I don't like the basement in Act 1 because it just doesn't make sense. Like, how did the neighbour possibly dig out this much space underground? And this is Act 1. It's only Act 3 and 4 that are set in a dream, but I suppose that is just a bit of a nitpick. So on to Act 2, which starts with Nicky Roth leaving the basement and trying to escape the neighbour's house, which is now surrounded by a massive fence, and the house itself is much bigger as well. Like, I don't know how the council gave the neighbour planning permission, but hey, let's not focus on that, because in Act 2 you have 3 different ways of escaping, or you can just jump the fence at the right spot, because for some reason they didn't think to include invisible walls that are usually seen as a problem, because a lot of games will just put them in open spaces to stop you from going in a certain direction. But in this case, you're not supposed to jump the fence that way, and it's a massive gate anyways, so having invisible walls would have been completely fine, and you know, they shouldn't have been too hard to include, but anyways, when you finish this act, however you finish it, Nicky Roth will begin to run home now that he's free, although he has trauma now, which is why when he comes back as an adult in Act 3, he enters a dream sequence where the neighbour has returned, only this time he has the house from Alpha 3 and 4. which I really don't like, but the worst thing this act does is the mini games, as they're all just awful, especially the shopping mini game, because they made it so that you have to throw your items into your cart. But the cart is taller than you, and every item has ragdoll physics, so trying to get items in your cart is like trying to pull off a Dude Perfect shot, even though it should be shockingly simple, and the mannequins running around can steal items from your cart, so you might have to throw stuff in twice, and the other two mini games aren't much better. Like, one of them is just a platformer again, because tinyBuild have some strange obsession with platforming, and the other is basically just an RNG minigame, as there is no strategy here. Hell, there was more strategy to the Fall Guys game, Fruit Shoot, which is literally just a game where you get fruit shot you constantly. So, playing through these mini-games, not something I can say I enjoy doing. However, once you beat each mini-game, you can finally make your way through the basement and enter Act 4, which is a boss fight against a giant version of the neighbor that's completely underwhelming, but that's not the biggest problem with the full release. The biggest problem is just the overall quality. I mean, looking at it makes me think that Alpha 1 looked better, and it's also just a completely buggy mess. Something that you should expect from the alphas, but certainly not the full release. And mind you, it didn't have any missing textures like Alpha 4, but that's just the bare minimum. So at the end of the day, you're better off just playing Alpha 1, which was free, by the way, unlike the full release that had a £30 price tag, which is far too much when you consider how good the alphas were in comparison to the full release, which was not only unpolished, but just overall mediocre as well. But wait, we're not done here, because Hello Neighbor was a success despite being as unpolished as it was. So Hello Neighbor would eventually go from being a singular indie game shitshow to a franchise shitshow. So why don't we just go ahead and talk about the rest of this franchise, starting with the next big mainline game. Hello Neighbor 2 was released on the 6th of December 2022, although before we talk about the game itself, I want to talk about some of the stuff leading up to it, such as Hello Guest, which was a game that was unlocked via a code that you received from doing an event in a Hello Neighbor spin-off called Secret Neighbor, that I'll talk more about later. But back to the point, as in Hello Guest, you worked at a rundown amusement park as a security guard, and your one job was to start the old roller coaster up again, all whilst getting rid of vandals and avoiding the guest, who had a similar build to the neighbor, only he was wearing a bird mask, and this guy was actually pretty scary because he could only move when you weren't looking at him, which made for some pretty decent scares, and this game was actually really well received. But soon enough, Hello Guest would disappear for the Hello Neighbor 2 Alpha 1, which was actually pretty good as well, because the guest was still the antagonist, and there was actually some pretty cool features that made gameplay far more interesting than the original Hello Neighbor. And the developers were also teasing some pretty big things at this time that only built more hype for the game, like how the neighbor would have a neural network AI, which meant that the neighbor was constantly evolving. So he could get really clever and even fake you out at some points just to catch you. But the problem with this is that it takes millions of attempts to teach an AI how to play a game to an actually decent level, and there was no way that the developers had time to teach it, so that job would fall on the people playtesting the game. But then another problem arises, as if the AI gets too smart, it could begin using glitches in the game to beat you, which would make the game completely unfair, so they would need a way of regulating that too. And I'm not going to claim to be some game developing genius, but I can see how hard that would be to develop and regulate, so including this in the game would be very difficult. But that's not the only big promise they made, as they also promised that this would be an open world game, with one main quest to break into the neighbor's house and multiple other houses you can explore as well. Although this didn't stick. Instead, they kept up the theme of having good early alphas and then progressively getting worse over time. And when the full game came out, it was interesting to say the least, as one, it was missing the promised neural network AI, although this was long after they'd already promised it for the pre-orders, so people could have pre-ordered this game thinking that the game still included a neural network AI, only to not have it when the game was released, which is something that they should have been more vocal about, but that wasn't wasn't the only issue, as the open world was definitely not there, making the game far more linear yet again, although I will say there are things I like about this game, such as the new art style, which really could just be the same as the last one, but it looked a lot cleaner to me. And I like the way puzzles were done in this game as well, because a lot of them made much more sense than the first game. So yeah, I did like some stuff, but the game itself wasn't that good and just missed a lot of stuff that would have made it good. Like hell, the bird who was the main antagonist in the first two alphas only shows up like twice in the entire game as some sort of Easter egg, which is just weird, and from what I've seen, the DLC is even worse. Because from what I've seen of them, they're completely buggy and extremely unpolished. One of them even seems to have missing assets altogether, but I'll stop talking about them now because I haven't really played them, so this is just what I've heard. But yeah, from what I have heard, they're not very good, so I won't be buying them. I'd like to spend my money on better things, but that is all I have to say for Hello Neighbor 2, so why don't we just move on and talk about the Hello Neighbor spin-offs. Starting with Hello Neighbor Hide and Seek, which was actually a prequel to the first game from the perspective of the neighbor's children, and the game itself is set in imaginary worlds where you have to find a certain number of toys to win, whilst being pursued by your brother who'll be dressed up as a different thing in each level, and this game was actually kinda cool. But I think that this game suffers from having weird puzzles as well, so the game can be very confusing at points, although that could just be a personal issue as I couldn't make it past the second level, but I do think this game is better than the original Hello Neighbor, so they've at least got that going for them. But up next is Secret Neighbor, which is best described by saying that it's what you would get if you combined Hello Neighbor with Dead by Daylight. And you know, I played a good bit of it back in 2019, but looking back on it now, it's just kind of okay. It's nothing really special, and if I'm being honest, the in-game transactions made it look even worse. So if you want to play a game like this, I really just recommend playing Dead by Daylight. But nothing can look as stupid as the Hello Neighbor kart racing game, Hello Engineer, where you have to build your own car and then race around with it. And there's nothing really bad about that, but it's obvious that they just grabbed a popular game concept and stuck their Hello Neighbor branding on it to just make a quick buck. But ain't nobody buying this when they could play the best kart racing game, Garfield Kart, which makes every other kart racing game look pathetic and absolutely shit. But moving on, as they also made a VR game called Hello Neighbor Search and Rescue. And I'm going to be upfront with you and say that I didn't play this, and even if I wanted to, I couldn't because I don't have a VR headset. But I will say that this does seem like a little bit of a cash grab as well, but hey. None of these spin-offs can compare to the Hello Neighbor cartoon, which was 100% made for children, so this series should act as a sign to everyone that Hello Neighbor is not a horror game. It's a horror game for kids, and I think that was obvious all the way back in Alpha 2 for the original game. But that's fine, game companies are allowed to target their games towards children. But this show was just not good, although that said, the neighbor was a badass in this, so maybe this show was actually perfect, because that's what I wanted for a long time, a badass neighbor. And also, we have this show to thank for the hilarious tweets begging MatPat for a theory, so this show was absolutely worth it. And aside from a cartoon, they also made books that I refuse to read, like hell, I've got the Harry Potter books sitting on my shelf, and I haven't read those, so there is no chance I am reading this shit. The only book I've read to completion, aside from manga, is Of Mice and Men, and that's because I had to. But that aside, it is clear to me why these books were made. It's because of the Five Nights at Freddy's books. Simple as that. They just wanted to have the same success that Five Nights at Freddy's had with their book series. But that is all of the major Hello Neighbor spin-offs, and no, I will not be talking about all of the merch because I'd like to keep my sanity, so why don't we just go ahead and conclude things. So, in conclusion, Hello Neighbor is a horror game that would have been much better if they kept doing what they were doing all the way back in the pre-alpha and alpha 1, instead of switching to this sort of horror games for kids stuff, as back then, not only did the game have better gameplay, but it also had a fantastic art style that was scrapped for this more cartoony looking one. So my only advice for you if you want to get into Hello Neighbor is play Alpha 1, as it's considerably better than the main game, the second game, and all of the spin-offs. But of course, if you do enjoy any of these games, this video isn't made to poke fun at you. In fact, if you enjoy any of the things I've talked about in this video, then I'm happy for you, but this video was made to look at the games from a critical standpoint, and when looking at them critically, I can see that this franchise has fallen from grace and lost sight of what it was really supposed to be. Which is why I can only recommend Alpha 1 or maybe Hello Guest, because that's pretty decent too. But that is just about all that I have to say for Hello Neighbor, although before I go, I'd quickly like to say a little something about my channel, really only about how much horror I've been covering recently. And the reason for that is that I really like horror, and I'm trying to move away from doing such regular One Piece content. Although, just because I've talked about horror a lot recently, that won't be the only thing I'll be doing, so you can rest assured knowing that I will be doing videos on other topics as well. And now that I've said that, I will properly finish, so if you did enjoy this video, please make sure to smash that like button, leave a comment down below, and hit that big red subscribe button, because we are aiming for a total of 1,000 subs by the end of the year, and any help in that goal would be much appreciated. However, with that all said and done, goodbye to you lovely, lovely people.